press the bell icon so you can stay notified whenever I upload a new video. Helen Keller was born on 27 June 1880 in Tuscumbia, a small town in northern Alabama. And in these videos, I walk you through the chapter summaries of The Story of My Life, a novel written by Helen Keller.
The winter of 1892 was darkened by the one cloud in Helen's childhood's bright sky. Books had lost their charm for her. A little story called The Frost King, which Helen had written and sent to Mr. Anagnos, the director of the Perkins Institution for Blind, was at the root of trouble. She wrote the story when she was at home, the autumn after she had learned to speak. Miss Sullivan and Helen Keller had stayed up at Fern Quarry later than usual. While they were there, Miss Sullivan had described to her the beauties of the late foliage, and it seemed that her descriptions revived the memory of a story which must have been read to her, and which she must have unconsciously retained. Helen thought that she was making up a story. Helen grew excited and started writing the story words and thoughts. Expressions flew from her finger ends, and she was absolutely delighted to be so creative. All her ideas and thoughts come to her from others, so there was no clear demarcation between her ideas and what she had heard from others. The whole family was delighted to hear Helen's story. Someone doubted it and questioned Helen whether she had copied it from a book. Helen was sure that it was her original story and declared that she had written the story for Mr. Anagnos. Helen wrote it down and sent it to Mr. Anagnos on his birthday. He was delighted, and the story was published in one of the Perkins Institution's reports. SLUR of plagiarism. Soon it came to light that a story similar to The Frost King, called The Frost Fairies, written by Miss Margaret T. Canby, had appeared in a book called Birdie and His Friends. The two stories were quite similar in thought and language. This made Helen's story a plagiarism. Helen felt extremely bitter, and she could not recall when she had heard the story being read out to her. She felt most grieved at the thought that she had brought suspicion to her minds and her loved friends like Mr. Anagnos, who had been most kind and considerate to her. Investigation and cross-examination regarding the authenticity of the story. Mr. Anagnos felt deceived and believed that Miss Sullivan and Helen had conspired to copy the story of another person deliberately to impress him. Helen was produced before a court of investigation composed of teachers and officers of the institute, and Miss Sullivan was asked to leave. Helen felt extremely humiliated and could not answer properly. When she left the room, she was so disturbed that even her teacher's loving words could not pacify her. She wished to die. Helen investigates the truth. Helen was not in a mood to forget and forgive. Miss Sullivan was sure that she had never heard of the Frost Fairies, so she could not have read it out to her. With the help of Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, Helen investigated the matter and discovered that Miss Sophia had probably read the story to her at Brewster. If you're not sure who Miss Sophia and the place Brewster is, then check out chapter 10. Everything is covered there. However, it was confirmed that she did have Birdie and His Friends, but it could not be found. Helen analyzed her mind deeply but could not clearly remember how these circumstances were created and how the same kind of language had remained stamped on her mind. A sense of discouragement. Miss Sullivan tried to distract Helen's mind from the bitter controversy, but Helen could not get over it. She felt discouraged even during writing letters to her mother. Look at this extract. But the fact remains that Miss Canby's story was read to me once, and that long after I had forgotten it, it came back to me so naturally that I never suspected that it was the child of another mind. These words show that Helen easily grasped words and stories that were read out to her, that she could not distinguish between what were her own ideas and what she had heard. The person who is referred to over here, except one, is Mr. Anagnos. Miss Canby herself wrote kindly, "Someday you will write a great story of your own head that will be a comfort and help to many." But this prophecy has never been fulfilled. I have never played with words again for the mere pleasure of game. Helen had the habit of assimilating what she heard, and many times she prevented those things in her writing. Once she had written about the old cities of Greece, an expression she had heard, and the sources she had forgotten. Helen had gathered every bit of poetry and history regarding Italy and Greece to please Mr. Anagnos. Since these ideas were not original, so her composition did not inspire any interest. Young writers assimilate and imitate, consciously or unconsciously, and it is only in the later years that they develop their own writing style. In your novel, learn some lines by heart so that you can reproduce it in the paper, and such lines can prove to be helpful in fetching some extra marks and brownie points. So I suggest you learn a few sentences like this to support your statements. Difficulties in creativity. Helen was too young to differentiate her own thoughts from the ones she read. This experience of frost fairies matured her, but she lost the sympathy of her dearest friend, Mr. Anagnos. Mr. Anagnos's confession. When Helen's book, The Story of My Life, was published in the Ladies' Home Journal, Mr. Anagnos stated that he had always known that Helen was innocent. 4 of the judges in the investigation case were blind and 4 were with sight. 4 believed that Miss Canby's story had been read to Helen, and Mr. Anagnos had cast his vote in Helen's favor. For 2 years, Mr. Anagnos had believed that Helen was innocent, but later he went back on his statement. Helen did not wish to know the background or the other details. She had moved on in life and had overcome the bitterness that had been created.
If you like this video, please subscribe and like. And for more such videos, you can click here. Till then, bye.